favourite things. In Pali literature, because obviously of the audience and the context, it's a series for scholars and students of Pali literature and Theravada studies. But you'll notice that I snuck a little beyond in there. And just want to explain that briefly. Basically, what I want to do is talk about the relationship between Pali Jatakas and other Indian Jatakas, both textual and visual, which has been an ongoing thread of my research. And that's because although quite a lot is made of the idea that the core of the Pali Jataka collection, that is to say the verses, predates sectarian divisions, there's not actually really any evidence that that's the case for anything other than a few individual verses or story elements. So the collection as a whole, and in fact the very notion of having a specific collection for Jatakas and only Jatakas, and a collection that large, seems to be distinctive to the Pali tradition. And other Buddhist schools also have Jatakas, and sometimes what we might consider to be the same Jatakas, but they tell them and collect them in quite different ways. So one of the threads of my research that's continued alongside other projects for all the years since my doctoral project on Pali Jataka literature has been how the Jataka genre works in other contexts beyond Pali literature. And so, for example, just give you a non-comprehensive list of places you might find Jatakas in Indian Buddhism. So in addition to Pali literature, which of course goes beyond the great Jataka collection through Charya-Pitaka, Upadana, Buddhavamsa, of course there are later collections of Jatakas as well, and also Jatakas embedded in some of the Sutta and Vinaya materials, as well as throughout the commentaries. But then you get all these other materials such as the Avadana Shataka and the Divyavadana, the Northern Avadana collections, closely related to the Mula Savastivada Vinaya. You also get Jataka Mala literature, the more sort of literary, courtly Sanskrit style of telling Jatakas. There's also the Mahavastu, which is fascinating in itself. You also find Jatakas throughout Mahayana sutras. And then there's a whole load more literature that we only have attested through Chinese and Tibetan translations. So there's a huge amount more to Jatakas than just the Pali Jataka book. And then, of course, we have all the visual evidence for Jatakas as well. And because of this fascination I have with the genre, I've been trying for many years to set up a better research resource for studying them across the different literatures. And a couple of years ago, thanks to funding from the Leverhulme Trust, I was finally able to realise this ambition and set up a Jataka database. And I'm not going to share it with you live because it's very slow. It's one of its downsides. So you'll have to settle for some screenshots, which unfortunately will be far too small to really appreciate. But if you want to have a look at the resource while I'm talking or later, you can click on the URL. I believe that works for people here. You can click and have an explore yourself. But basically, where I've got to is this web page, and it contains already about 700 textual stories, a far smaller number of images so far. It's very much a work in progress. You can see that so far we've included the stories from 5 Sanskrit collections and 4 Pali collections, including all 547 of the Pali Jatakas. So there's already quite a lot of material on here, but we're still expanding it and growing it. And a major part of the project is to include material and visual evidence for Jatakas as well, because I think there's a huge amount to learn from understanding how and which stories travelled and took root in different places, in different sectarian contexts. To give just one example, the sites of the Andhra school, so Amaravati, Nagarjunakonda, and also more recently excavated Kanaganahalli, which, although it's slightly further away in Karnataka, is part of the iconographic family, if you like, of the Andhra school. The narratives depicted there suggest that there are swathes of Jataka and other narrative literature that we don't have in textual form, either because texts were lost or because stories were never put into writing in the first place. But that whole iconographic agenda there suggests a whole different set of narrative literature that was current in that area. So to give you a sense of how the database works, You can search for stories in texts. So just as an example, this is a screenshot of me searching for stories in the Avadana Jataka about the theme of bodily sacrifice. And then it gives you the results and you can look at them all. And what the entries show is full text and characters, places, names, rebirth identifications, and so on. You can also search stories in art, and here we concentrated on visual elements and searching in that way, and we also include inscriptions. And I want to make a big shout out here to Dr. Chris Clark, who did a huge amount of the legwork on this during his year and a bit with me in Edinburgh recently. So thank you, Chris, for that. My favourite feature, but also in some ways the most challenging, is the story clusters feature. And this was our solution to the question of how to link visual and verbal Jatakas together where they seem to be narrating the same or similar stories. And again, it's very much a work in progress, but it's already started to map how stories occur across different media and regions. I'm going to return to the question of clusters later on, but here's just one example of a cluster where we have stories about Mandata, and we have 2 textual examples so far in the database. There are many more that are not yet in the database, and 1 visual example at Kanaganahalli. And for the visual Jatakas, we are including images where we can. So that's the database, but we've gone a little bit too long on a presentation about stories without actually telling a story. So let's rectify that next. Here is a story for you. And that long pause wasn't just so that I could have a cup of tea, it was also to make a point, namely that it has generally been assumed that visual Jatakas are aiming to prompt a narration of a story in the minds of a viewer, and that they're supposed to affect the viewer very much in the same way as the hearer of a story. So viewing this visual Jataka should be just like me telling you the story, and I suspect it probably wasn't. So we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. But meanwhile, let's just have a look at this image. So this is a stone relief from the early Buddhist site of Barhut in Madhya Pradesh, and it dates perhaps to the 1st century BCE. It's actually 3 parts of a pillar, so you have to kind of reconstruct them in your mind. And it's a pretty dramatic image. It's one of my favourites. You can see there's a person being hung upside down by the ankles in the middle, and another on a horse about to take flight with someone else hanging onto the tail. Other people around watching. There's a tree and a rocky landscape behind. And if you've had prior experience of early Indian narrative art, you might realise that the image is not actually of lots of different characters, but fewer key characters repeated multiple times. So even if you don't recognise the story, you're probably going to be able to tell that it is a story, that something's going on here that involves characters and their actions and experiences over the course of time. Out of interest, if anybody does know what this story is, would you be able to put your virtual hand up, just so I can see how many people are able to recognise this? Got two people know what this story is. Well, that's good. 3 including me. Thanks very much. So perhaps if you don't know what story it is, you might hope that the inscriptional label, which you might just be able to spot there in the middle, will help. The label reads Vidura Punikya Jatakam, or the Jataka of Vidura and Punika, and that might help to prompt recognition from more people in the audience. So then if we want to find out more about this image, what do we do? So quite likely we reach for a copy of the text. That is to say, the story of a past life of the Buddha when he was the wise man Vidura and was abducted by a yaksha named Punika. It's a pretty straightforward identification, actually. Once we have read the rich and dramatic narrative extant in the Vidura Pandita Jataka, which is number 545 in the Pali Literature, we can easily identify what's going on. Punaka, who is a yaksha, is enticed by a Naga princess that he wishes to marry, shown in the topmost scene on the left, to abduct Vidura as a sort of bride price. Travels through the air on his magical horse, with Vidura instructed to hold on to the tail. And then, having arrived on a mountain, Punaka tries to kill Vidura, but Vidura converts him with a Dhamma talk, and Punaka then takes Vidura to the Naga realm, depicted again on the upper part of the pillar, where Vidura gives them all a teaching. And the bottom part of the pillar seems to depict the human realm, the Kuru kingdom, where Punaka wins Vidura in a game of dice from his master, the king. So the pillar as a whole depicts the whole narrative, with quite a lot of the details that we find in the written narrative, but it does so in a spatial rather than temporal arrangement. So we have both the scenes in the Naga realm on the top portion of the pillar, for example. So I consider this image to be a good historical and historiographical starting point for any discussion of Indian Jatakas, for a few different reasons. So Bharhut provides actually our earliest evidence for Jatakas, with its depictions of well over 30 of them, often accompanied by inscriptional labels, some of which are close to titles or even verse phrases still preserved in the Pali Jataka collection. And so, in part because of those labels, scholars have been quick to reach for textual versions of stories, usually from the great Pali collection, to explain what's going on in the images. The presence of the reliefs and their labels is therefore sometimes used to date the emergence of a Jataka genre, and even used to make a case for the early origins of the Pali collection, despite the clear mismatch between a text of over 500 stories and a site depicting less than 10% of that number, including, I should add, some tales as yet unidentified with any Pali correlate. The labels also have prompted discussions of how stories might have functioned at such sites. So they've often been assumed to be mnemonic story prompts to help out monastic tour guides, perhaps, who would recall a story and then use it to edify and entertain the illiterate lay visitors that were assumed to be passing through. So I think it's important to pause and unpick a few of those assumptions. Why, for example, have we reached for the story in the Pali Jataka collection? The inscription's not in Pali. A reasonable answer might be because that's the only place we can find a story of Vidura and Punaka. And Vidura and Punaka are identified in the inscription. But in the collection that we have now, it's actually called the Vidura Pandita Jataka, the birth story of Vidura the Wise. And Punaka is not important enough to even merit a rebirth identification in the extant Pali narrative, although 8 more minor characters are given an identification, which is interesting in itself. The scholarly tendency towards textual priority, by the way, is pretty clear from the fact that this image is often labelled as the Vidura Pandita Jataka, despite clearly being named in the inscription after Punaka as well. The vagaries of titling aside, the Pali collection might be the only extant textual narrative of the story of Vidura in an Indian language, as far as I'm aware. I wouldn't be surprised to find some elsewhere as my research continues. But there's no reason to assume that it's always been the case. And indeed, there is evidence to the contrary, because it is depicted as a visual narrative at various sites in rather different ways. So, for example, in the site of Kanaganahalli in Karnataka, which, as I mentioned earlier, is iconographically part of the Andhra or Amaravati school, where we don't have an extant textual corpus that matches the visual corpus in any straightforward way. So we find the story of Vidura and Punaka again, and this is Monica Zinn's line drawing, which she's very kindly allowed me to use. And the way she identifies the narrative is that on the top right, we have Punaka asking the Naga king and queen for their daughter's hand. So you can see the Nagas always have these little cobra hoods at the back of their heads, so that helps with identifications. On the top left, we have Punaka speaking with the human king. And then on the bottom right, we have Punaka playing dice with the king, which is how he wins the king's minister, Vidura. And then on the bottom left, we have Vidura giving a sermon to the Nagas with Punaka present as well. So you might immediately notice that there are some key visual elements missing. There's no flying horse, there's no swinging upside down, but we do have some of the core aspects of the story, and we have an inscription again, as at Barahut, clearly identifying the story as the Jataka of Vidura Punaka. At Ajanta, where the story is depicted in Cave 2, we also have no holding on to a flying horse's tail, nor being turned upside down, but we do have a demon with his horse, we have a gambling match with a human king, we have a Naga lady swinging on her swing in a very seductive way, seeking to entice the lover who's going to capture Vidura for her. And very, very prominent at Ajanta, Vidura giving a teaching in the realm of the Nagas. In other words, there were different narratives, visual and verbal, in circulation that offered different takes on the adventures of the wise Bodhisattva Vidura. And the classic narratological distinction between story, in other words, events, and narrative, that is to say, the telling of these events, can be quite helpful here. We might say that there are many narratives of the story of Vidura. In Ajanta, the focus would seem to be Vidura's teaching abilities, a scene picked up also in Amaravati. Meanwhile, the Pali text plays around with imagery in its elaboration on other scenes. For example, Punaka has this wonderful demonstration of the power of his horse, who's able to dance on water and all sorts, and also shows off the jewel that he plans to stake in the dicing match, which has various magical powers. So there's scope for the different narratives to elaborate on different scenes, on different aspects of the story. And the situation is complicated further by the presence of Vidura, wise minister to the Kurus, in the Hindu epic Mahabharata, where, however, he is not abducted by a yaksha, nor subjected to a precarious journey to the realm of the Nagas. His story is most definitely not the same, yet perhaps he is the same. After all, he is a wise teacher of the Dharma. Indeed, in the Mahabharata, he is the god Dharma incarnate. And he is advisor and steward, that is to say, kata, it's the same term in the Mahabharata as in the Pali Jataka, to a Kuru king who is overly fond of gambling. And indeed, the king in the Pali Jataka is called Dhananjaya, which is a name sometimes given to one of the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata. The Pali text even contains a little resonance with a famous dilemma at the heart of the Mahabharata. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mahabharata, but one of the core turning points is when Queen Draupadi is lost at dice by her gambling husband king, and she challenges it, and she challenges the idea that she was owned by him, that he could have lost her, and through her actions and her arguments, she is able to actually regain the freedom of her husband and his brothers, who are also her husbands. There's a really interesting little moment in the Pali Vidura Pandita Jataka where Punaka asks Vidura whether or not he is owned by the king. And if he is, then he's been won at dice by the demon and must leave his home and his family and go wherever his new master desires. And if he's not, then he may stay. So there's an obvious temptation there for Vidura to say that he's not owned by the king. But no, he considers that there's no refuge in the world better than the truth. And so he admits to being owned by the king. And because of that, he has to travel with Punaka off to the Naga realm. And it may well be that this little exchange is the reason why the story becomes associated quite strongly with the Bodhisattva's perfection of truth rather than wisdom, or as well as wisdom. So the vast intertextuality of Indian narrative reminds us that while we might consider the characters or events that make up stories as worthy of study beyond the narratives that contain them, so thinking about Vidura as a character that we might study not only in a particular text, but across different texts or indeed visual depictions. But ultimately, we've only got the narratives to turn to for evidence. So we're trying to study these characters, these stories, through a range of different visual and verbal evidence. And I hope that I've already managed to convince you that this narrative evidence should include images as well as texts. and also that we should be wary of assuming the priority or antiquity or universality of the Pali Jatakas. We see them as just one part of a huge range of Jatakas in circulation. Returning just to the Jataka database, I noted that this has been set up to try to account for these different examples of Jatakas in text and art. So one of the ways in which we approached this was to consider each story in text as its own entry and each story in art as its own entry. So we're not trying to take an idea of a story of which there are different versions and different depictions. We're considering them all as independent, but then when they appear to be related, we then put them into what we call story clusters. And of course, there's a fair bit of subjective judgment behind whether or not to set up a cluster or to include a particular narrative within it. But the idea is that it's a flexible concept that moves us away from the idea of versions and originals, but also moves us away from always treating narrative images as somehow dependent upon or explained by texts. And one of the key benefits of thinking about visual and verbal narratives as parallel units of analysis is that we can also then see artistic sites and textual collections as parallel units of analysis. And this was quite a penny drop moment for me as we were setting up the database. And I was getting my head into how you structure relational databases, a whole new world for me. So every story in text in the database belongs to a narrative collection, textual collection. And every story in art belongs to a site, an artistic site. So then you get these as parallel units. And so just as we might ask why, for example, a particular 34 stories were chosen for inclusion in Arya Shura's Jatakamala and how his framing of the stories affects their impact, we can ask the same questions as to why, for example, the creators of the Bahut visual scheme or the Ajanta cave scheme chose the particular images that they did and how their arrangement and framing affect their impact. Now, at some sites, there may be a conscious attempt to illustrate a set of textual narratives. In fact, that's the case for some of the caves at Ajanta. But in many, there's no such agenda, and I think they need to be studied as independent narrative collections. And these studies then need to take into account the effect of encountering a curated and framed set of narratives, rather than just focusing in on a single story taken out of context. So those studies can be useful too. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we really miss a lot if we consider a Jataka image to be explained once we've identified a textual narrative that seems to correspond to it. We can't assume that visual narratives function simply to prompt a narration in the minds of the viewer, even if helped by a local storyteller. So, as Robert Brown pointed out long ago in a book that really influenced my own work right from the beginning of my postgraduate time, there's a lot of Jataka images that are depicted out of sight, either very, very high overhead or even sometimes covered up. And they're also often portrayed in single, rather enigmatic scenes that seem rather unlikely to prompt recognition in a visitor. And certainly Brown argued, and I've argued not dissimilarly, that their place in early stupa sites may well be more to do with sacred presence or the potency of the perfections or of Buddhahood itself than to do with any storytelling agenda. And of course, just as each textual collection may have a different purpose or purposes, so too with each site. So there is still a lot to learn. And I've been enjoying hanging out with art historians more and more in recent years, and a part of the database project involved a symposium and a volume which I'm trying to write the introduction to at the moment, bringing together scholars of textual narrative and visual narrative and thinking about some of the ways in which imagery works across those different media. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about this project is that seeking to understand Jataka images has actually helped me to understand texts better, as well as the other way around. And so, for example, consider the effects of visiting a site where there's a whole collection of monoscenic Jataka images. So Jatakas that are depicted from a single scene, perhaps a key character, a key moment, quite elusive potentially. You may or may not recognize them. They may or may not be labeled. And then compare that with a text containing very brief textual allusions to narratives. So, for example, in the Mahayana Rastrapala Paripricha Sutra, we find Shakyamuni Buddha in the first person recounting 50 of his past lives in a very concise verse form. So I'll give you an example from Daniel Bush's translation, which hopefully you'll recognize, although in fact it's one that's not present in the Pali collection. For the sake of the lives of the tiger cubs, I gave up my life so that the tigress would be satiated. Hosts of gods in the sky applauded, "Well done, great man, whose heroic exertion is steadfast." So hopefully you recognize this one. It's a story, famous story of the Bodhisattva sacrificing himself to feed a starving tigress and prevent her from eating her own newborn cubs. And in this text, we find 50 stories, but they're not full stories. They're really references to past life adventures. So are we to read, or indeed hear, this list of allusions to stories and pause at each one to tell ourselves the full story? Or indeed ask a more learned companion or a teacher to do so? It's possible, but it's not what is encouraged by the text itself, and it seems rather unlikely. More likely, perhaps, is that the mention of life after life after life, of extraordinary demonstration of the perfections of the Bodhisattva, speaks to the audience about the qualifications of the Buddha and also the seriousness of the Bodhisattva path. And indeed, the verses in this text are framed within a discussion of what is required of a Bodhisattva. So in other words, what I'm suggesting here is that the experience of hearing or reading these allusions to Jatakas in the Rastrapala Paripricha, or indeed in the several Jatakastava texts that take a similar approach, might not actually be that different to the experience of seeing Jatakas decorating a stupa site. Devotion or faith, all are possible outcomes that take us beyond, or even at times bypass, the necessity of a simple narrative response, a recognition that involves the telling of a story. And indeed, it's not only a narrative response that might be bypassed. The presence of these allusions might even have potency without any sort of audience interaction at all, simply by being created or being present as acts of merit making or as ways of localizing powerful forces. So I hope I've convinced you of 3 things in this brief talk. No, I hope I've convinced you of 4 things. I'm going to add one. Firstly, the one that I've just added, that it might be fun to have a little exploration of the database. I really, really enjoy this database far too much, and I hope that you can have some fun with it too, exploring its features. In terms of the research conclusions, though, I really would encourage you to consider looking beyond the Pali collection and making sure not to assume that the Pali collection represents a single early Buddhist perspective on the Buddha's past lives. It really was one of many perspectives on what a Jataka is and is for, and indeed how it might function at different sites and in different texts. Secondly, I hope I've convinced you, oh, that's become thirdly now, I've confused myself with my extra firstly. Thirdly, that it's worth bringing visual and verbal narratives together, learning from both media and using such explorations to gain a fuller picture, pun fully intended, of what Jatakas meant to early Buddhist communities. And fourthly, or thirdly, and finally, that as well as looking at individual stories, we can learn a lot by paying attention to the framing both of textual collections and of visual or material sites, in order to try and understand this wonderfully rich genre that is the stories of the Buddha's past lives. So I'll leave it there, and look forward to any questions or comments you might have. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Naomi. This is fascinating. I really have to resist going immediately to your database to look at that now. But now we will open for the Q&A. Everyone, please note that this Q&A is being recorded. There are two ways to ask questions. One is you click on your screen and there should be a floating menu bar with a hand, so you can raise your hand there to ask a question. Or you can write your question in the chat and then I will read the question. So please go ahead. Does anyone have a question for Naomi? Well, maybe while people are still thinking, well, I see Kate. Okay.
It's because I wanted Naomi to say a bit about her books in relation to this project, particularly the recent book. So if she could just update us on the publications, that would be really great. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, thanks. That's a good invitation. So, and I think I saw that there was some posting of a book there. Yeah, so my latest book, Many Buddhas, One Buddha, is all about the Avadana Jataka, which is a slight digression. And it was a digression that began because I was interested in the Jātakas in that collection. And after I dealt with the Jātakas, I got kind of too sucked in and couldn't put the text down, and teamed up with some other scholars to try and tackle the whole collection, and ended up with this book that covers the 2 chapters of Jātakas, but also a chapter of stories about predictions to Buddhahood, and a chapter of stories about Pratyeka Buddhas, which have become a fascinating tangent too. So that book is a slight tangent in some ways. And I guess, though, my 2 strands of research have really carried on right from the beginning. One is Jātakas and Buddhist literature. And then the other is thinking about the broader contexts more. So there's very much been a thread of interest throughout. Probably Buddhist studies audiences don't know my other books so well, but I've got one on karma and rebirth stories in Buddhist and Jain literature, and one on characters shared across Buddhist, Jain and Hindu stories, which for some reason doesn't include Vidura, but it should do. Maybe there's another project there. And then the current project, the database, is still growing. It's very much a live project. And I mentioned this volume I'm editing, this wonderful symposium I had almost exactly a year ago in Edinburgh. And the volume for that is coming out with Equinox next year, assuming I manage to finish my introduction before then. And that's called Visual Narratives and Narrative Visions in Indian Buddhism. And it's a brilliant collection of a mixture of scholars of texts and scholars of art. So there's Monica Zinn has a chapter in there, John Strong, Natalie Gummer's got a chapter in there. It's a wonderful, I'm so lucky to have got such a wonderful collection of scholars together to talk about some of my favourite questions and topics. So that one is one to look out for.
Thank you, Naomi. We have a question that's come up in the chat, and it says, just a basic question, can we use Pali Jataka Vandana to study Middle Period Buddhism or 3rd century BC, appears at Barhut I assume, 5th century CE, or can we not treat it as a historical source until as late as 5th century CE?
Oh, such a basic question, but such a complicated question. I think it's a part of the picture. I think it's a tricky text because it's many layered, and there's no simple way of excavating those layers. So the verses are certainly considered to be older, and they seem to be an older form of Pali. The commentary was not fixed until the 5th century, or maybe even the 6th century CE. But we know that there must have been some kind of prose circulating around those verses, because they make precious little sense without the prose. So some aspects, when you start digging into individual stories, some aspects seem to be quite old, and then maybe attested in other stories, in other contexts. And some aspects seem to suggest a commentator that may have misunderstood what's going on, or may not have been familiar sometimes with wider Indian narrative motifs. And that's been quite interesting when I've been studying some of the connections between the Pali Jatakas and Indian epic literature, for example, Mahabharata and Ramayana, because you get the impression sometimes that the stories by the time the stories are getting this commentary, they're quite rooted in a sort of Theravada world, away from such a strong influence from other Indian narrative circulations that might have been more prominent when they were first being formed. So there are some misunderstandings that creep in that make for quite interesting reading. So I think the answer is we can't treat it as a straightforward historical source for any period, actually, but we certainly can't assume that it is early Buddhist Jatakas. It is the product of quite a long period of evolution, and it contains one thread of perspectives on Jatakas in Indian Buddhism. Does that answer the question reasonably?
It sounds great to me. We'll see if if this particular questioner has. Oh yes, it says they say thank you. Okay. Are there any other questions? Perhaps while people are here, Peter, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, it's less a question on the specific content of what you've been talking about, but just to raise the issue that both Kate and I are involved with the consultation with the International Red Cross about Buddhist ethics and international humanitarian law. That's the law of war. And it certainly seems that the Jātakas are like, well, we've seen come across some which are relevant to kind of Buddhist attitude to moderating, reducing suffering during armed conflict. And I'm sure with your knowledge of the Jātakas, you might be able to point us towards some good Jātakas to look at. Maybe I can contact you by email about that.
Yeah, I might just send you off to the database. I think that
oh, you might well do, yes.
So one of the reasons I'm so excited about this database is because I have a terrible memory, and I'm very often contacted by people, actually quite often art historians. They just send me a photograph and say, any idea what Jataka this might be? And I never know. I never ever know. And so one of the reasons for the database is to provide that. It is a resource for me. It's a memory jog for me, but also for hopefully for other people as well, to sort of search through. And you can limit the search by text as well. You don't have to be interested in all the Sanskrit materials. But yeah, certainly, I think one of the tricky things, though, with treating the Pali Jataka collection as a source of ethical guidance is that it is very variable. Yeah. So not dissimilar to the Bible or something else. You know, it's you could probably find support for pretty much any position in a story there somewhere. Mm-hmm. So it becomes sometimes a bit of an exercise in cherry picking, I think. But on the other hand, there are some great cherries there. So why not?
There's a question in the chat. The question about history has reminded me of some work by Joe Cribb on coin mentions in Jātakas. I can't remember the details, though. Do you remember what his findings were?
As a simple answer, I'm afraid no. But that's such a good point, actually. I have a vague memory of having come across that. I should have a look through again. Certainly relevant to dating.
I have a question as well. We've been talking about quite ancient stuff, examples from your database. Do you have a time limit on the scale of this? I mean, are you going to include contemporary paintings, for instance, of Jātakas?
I certainly would love to. I mean, with these sorts of projects, it's about the resource. So that is to say, the money. It's reached the end of phase 1. That's it now. Certainly there are plans to expand it, but I think probably it won't go modern for a while. I think the next stage is to finish the Indian stuff and add a lot more of the art in. And we've got a lot of stuff we're getting ready behind the scenes. I mean, Ajanta is going up soon. Very kindly, Dieter Schlingloff has shared a whole load of his materials, and we've also been able to digitize some of the old photographs from the Yazdani volume. So Ajanta will be going up there next, and then other Indian sites and texts. And then actually I really want to get some of the Chinese and Tibetan materials on, because there's some really interesting evidence for Indian Jatakas in some of these other languages. So I think it will probably go into different languages before it goes modern. But who knows? Maybe if I manage to carry on in this career for another few decades, who knows where I'll get to by the end.
Yes, it would be tremendous. I see a hand raised from Anthony. Anthony, would you please unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you for the wonderful talk and for the database. I think it will help many people. I wanted to pick up on something that you had just said and ask a little bit of a guilty question, but it has to do with the role of Jatakas or maybe Avadanas framing other texts. And I'm particularly thinking of the Milinda Panha and the kind of the Bahira Kata or the Kuba Yoga of that frames that. And what's really interesting is in the Chinese version, you actually have that connected with the birth story of the king elephant, when the king elephant and the Buddha go to the forest. And then I think the king elephant is actually reborn, eventually becoming Nagasena. And then in the doctrine of the jewels, let's see, make sure I'm getting this right. Jewels of the Doctrine, in Sri Lanka, which is a little bit of a reworking, it actually has that same elephant birth story in there. So I guess I was hoping if you could talk a little bit about the idea of these kind of stories framing what we consider texts that are not Jatakas, and then if you have any specific insights into this whole Milinda Panha Bhikshu Nagasena Sutra nexus.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting questions. Maybe I'll answer the last one first, which is to say, no, I don't really have any great insights. I think the Milinda Panha stuff is really interesting because it gives us a glimpse, quite a rare glimpse of how Jatakas were viewed in an earlier age. And of course, there's a huge amount of debate about whether or not we should see Jatakas as being an attempt to record actual past lives or ethical stories, or is it really about glorifying the Buddha's ability to tell stories or his ability to see people's past lives? So there's a lot of other things going on in that the sort of perception of the genre, but in some ways that also speaks to your other question about framing. And I think we have had this problem in Western scholarship on Buddhist narrative literature, which is much less of a problem now, but it certainly has been a problem, of just tending to see stories as being just stories. And I think what we actually find in Buddhist literature is quite a complex set of understandings of these narratives as quite an important genre that is not, it's not about stories, it's about the Buddha and about what makes him a Buddha, and it's about what connects him to other people. And that speaks to a big debate around the distinction between Jatakas and Avadanas or Apadanas, and also to some sort of fascinating questions around the importance of other characters in these stories. So one of the things that happens in the Pali collection, I think, is that you get more and more emphasis on the Buddha, but in some other genres in Pali, but also in Sanskrit collections that include Jatakas, there may be more about other people. So there's a sort of emphasis more on communities and karmic bonds and so on. So that example of the elephant, that connection that you get is certainly quite a common one that you find. And of course, this crops up in commentaries as well. So it's a really big question, how the framing works. And certainly I think it's important to think about these stories as they appear in other genres as well, so that it's not just about studying the collections that are exclusively Jatakas or exclusively narrative. So does that answer your question in any way?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I will read one now from the chat. It says, given the way that crowd science has transformed astronomy, particularly through enabling the watching of larger expanses of space together, and the vastness of the Jataka literature, have you considered crowd science for the database?
That's a great question. Yes and no. In as much as I've certainly put out a general invitation to anybody who has any, hidden notes of all the Jatakas in a particular text or place or images to get in touch and to contribute. I'm not holding the reins in any particularly controlling way. But I think there's also, perhaps what you're talking about is the potential for people to be really creating an extra layer of the metadata for each of these stories. So I think it's just, for me, it's just about the logistics of it. You know, how would I do that? It's already been quite an interesting exploration into the structures of relational databases for me. But if you've got any tips, I'd love to hear them. I should say there are other sets of data I've been offered that I hope to include at some point. For example, all of the images of Pagan Jatakas that Lillian Handlin has built up a database of. But that's another, requires another set of resource to get those ready and uploaded and all the data attached. So hopefully that will happen as well.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Kate, please unmute yourself.
Hello, I'm not asking a question at the moment. It's just while people are thinking of their questions, I'd just like to remind people of Stephen Kemper's talk on Anagarika Dhammapala and enfranchising Sri Lankan laity next week. And then the following week, we have Becca Nelson talking about Thai Buddhism and single-use plastic. We also have a series of other talks. They're not on the website yet, but we decided to extend the talks until the end of Wasa. So Wasa ends the end of October, so we've got talks until the end of October, and we'll put those up soon, and the recordings for most of the talks are already up there. Thanks a lot. Sorry for the interruption.
It's great, and it's a wonderful series, and I do think this is one of the real silver linings of this otherwise pretty horrendous year, to be having these online gatherings, to be able to group together in ways that we wouldn't actually do if we were able to physically travel anyway. So thank you so much, everybody who's been involved in organising these.
I suppose there are also other kinds of media in which Jatakas appear. So there could be films, songs, other kinds of recordings.
Yeah, that's another question I've grappled with. So I suppose at heart, I'm still really an ancient historian type. So I'm interested in the early period, for which really the media we have are texts and images and occasionally inscriptions. But certainly I enjoy a good Jataka opera as much as the next girl. There's all sorts of fantastic stuff going on, particularly in the Theravada world, that it is wonderful to watch. And actually, again, I think I mentioned before we started, I was clearing out my office yesterday because I'm moving offices, and found all sorts of fun stuff that people have sent me over the years. I've even got a Jataka t-shirt, turns out.
What is on that?
Advertising the set of Jataka operas that came out relatively recently in Thailand.
Ah.
So yes. So there's definitely scope for huge expansion, and obviously cartoon books and all sorts as well. So this could get quite out of hand in the end, but with all things, you've got to start somewhere.
I know. I imagine. I mean, it just sounds like a completely amazing resource, but the amount of information is difficult to manage and
I think
to catalog.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, really, and certainly being just very selfish about it with my own research interests, because my interests are primarily in the earlier period. I'm unlikely to be prioritizing putting on the recordings of, I see in the comments, a suggestion of contemporary performances of the Jataka. I mean, I think that's a fascinating area of research, and I love reading about it and hearing about it. But because it's not my own research priority, it would be for somebody else to gather these materials together, and certainly we could find space for them.
Can you tell us a bit about your other ways of managing this material? Because I seem to remember you were trying to tweet the stories.
I gave up on that. Yeah.
It's a large body of literature. So tell us about your, what you have done and what you found can't be done at the moment.
Yeah, I I do get lost in it, and especially because I keep accidentally adding additional large bodies of literature to my interests. So, you know, the year I suddenly decided I was in love with the Mahabharata and needed to do a project on Jātakas and the Mahabharata, there's just too much fun stuff to read, isn't there? And as I mentioned, my memory is not good. So I do have various copious notes around the place, but really the database is the best system I've come up with. As you mentioned, I did try and tweet them a while ago, partly to just make myself reread them, but that fell by the wayside. I'm afraid I quit Twitter around about the same time as a certain person became a president. I didn't want to be sharing a platform, so that just fell by the wayside. And I have tried various forms of keeping notes, but actually I'm quite converted to this relational database structure, that it's a better brain than mine for this type of material. And the more I can get on there, then the more hopefully it will be of use both to me and for other people.
There is a question in the chat which says, have you thought any about children as audience versus adults, and how such audiences might have influenced the story elements or the narrative? Could you also say a bit more about the difference between story and narrative? Okay,
thanks. Yeah. Yes, I have thought about children as audience versus adults. I think this is again where it's so tempting to generalize, and there's actually so much evidence of diversity. So some of the Jātakas in the Pali collection are really dirty, like really, really definitely not for children. In fact, quite a lot of them are also quite clearly aimed at a monastic audience and have particular themes that are relevant to a monastic audience. There's a huge variety in the Pali collection, and then even more so once you look outside it. So yes, it's certainly possible that some stories may have been particularly popular with children and may have adjusted in that way. But I think actually the ones that we have preserved in the textual collections that come through the religious literature channels tend not to be. They tend to be for an adult audience and often for a monastic audience. So, I mean, for example, the Avadana Jataka stories are very, very highly devotional. They seem to be really for an audience of people trying to explore and express their faith in the Buddha and his greatness and his miraculous abilities and his revelation of past lives and future lives and all sorts. So it's really not about telling an animal story to a child to express a simple moral story. That doesn't seem to be how these stories are working in most of the textual collections, but there you go. Now I'm generalizing. Story and narrative. So the classical narratological distinction is between the events that make up a story and then an expression of those events in a narrative. That can be a helpful distinction. I find it a helpful distinction, but it can also cause problems in that it sort of implies that there's a story behind or before a narrative expression of it, whereas actually narrative theorists really emphasize the fact that there isn't a story outside of a narrative, but at the same time it's story plus narrative discourse equals narrative. I think where we get into trouble with Jataka literature, for example, where we often have multiple examples of a story in different texts, say, is that there's often been an assumption that one of those must be the original, or that perhaps there was an original underlying them, an oral tradition that underlie them. And so when you get this distinction between story and narrative, it can tempt you down that route into thinking that there is some story that is the original. And of course we see this also in, for example, quests for the historical life of the Buddha, where there's this understanding that somewhere behind all these narratives that we have must be a story that is actual events, that is somehow behind them all. So we can get tied up in knots with it in some respects, but I think it's helpful when we're trying to think about the relationships between different narratives, and also remembering that narratives can be in visual form as well as in verbal form. Does that answer your question?
It sounds very complete to me, but we'll see if there's yes. Okay. The first
yes. Good.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. We're just at 11 now. Is there any more questions? Otherwise, we may wind it up here. Here is one on the. There's a question on the chat. Okay, and it says, in Southeast Asian Buddhist festival, especially in Thailand and Eastern Shan State, Myanmar, they celebrate the ceremony every year, which based on Visantra Jataka. Why this Jataka is very famous than any others in the aspect of offering or doing dana, and how the Western perspective sees on this narrative ceremony and good activity.
That's a great question for just at the very end. Big long answer. Yes, so the Visantra Jataka in the Great Pali Jataka collection, the Visantra Jataka is the last story. It's the longest story, and it gains this tradition at some stage that it's the last human lifetime of the Bodhisattva. And it becomes very, very important in Theravada tradition. And yeah, as you say, these wonderful festivals and ritual reenactments and processions of scrolls and all sorts of interesting things that go on around the Visantra story. Why it's very famous, it's a tricky one. So it's not just in Theravada tradition that it's so famous. It's also singled out at several of the early Indian visual sites. So it's not that it becomes only famous and important in the Pali tradition, but it is particularly important in the Pali tradition. And I think that is linked somehow to the fact that it is the last story, the longest story. Although you might ask, is it the last and longest story because it's so important, or does it become important because it has been made the last and longest story? In other traditions and other texts, though, we do find other Visantra stories of varying forms. So it is found in lots of different languages as well. But it doesn't have the same significance, and neither does this particular act of dana, which of course is quite a challenging act to be considering to be exemplary, where Visantra gives away his children in particular. So what you get in the Sanskritic literature, for example, is a lot more bodily sacrifice, a lot more gouging out your eyes and chopping off your head and letting people eat your flesh and things like that. So it gets a little bit more focused on those types of sacrificial dana rather than on Visantra's type of dana. So it's a very big and complicated question, and the Visantra story also has connections to the Ramayana traditions of Indian epic. So as a narrative cycle, it's very interesting and quite complicated. In terms of the Western perspective on this, I'm not sure I would want to comment. I think that there have been some concerns both amongst Western scholars and amongst Buddhists about the idea that this is an exemplary deed to give away your children. But certainly it's a really rich and fascinating story. So lots to be learned from it.
Thank
and
you.
lots to read about it. So I'm certainly not. I don't specialize in this Jataka, but there's been an awful lot published about it that makes for interesting reading.
Yes, it almost seems impossible to discuss Jatakas without mentioning a Visantra story.
Well, it is a very fascinating one. I think it's a really. I tended to steer clear of it in my earlier work because I felt like that was all anybody was talking about. But actually, the more I work on Jataka literature more broadly, the more I keep coming back to this question about dana and about sacrifice. And for example, I've been working recently on some stories where the Bodhisattva sacrifices himself or his or feeds his children to a demon in order to access a single verse of Dharma, which is all that's available at the time. And this whole other subcluster of stories is really fascinating when you read that up against the Visantra story. You know, we all make so much of a fuss about whether it's really okay for Visantra to give his children away. And then there's this whole other set of stories where the Bodhisattva is feeding his children to a demon. So yeah, we maybe need to be a bit more balanced in how we see the different literatures.
In that regard, I was interested to see that you include as one of the search terms the themes. So this is actually something that could be quite useful for researching.
Yeah, hugely subjective, of course. And we did, Chris Clark and I had quite a lot of discussions around that selection of themes, and it did evolve slightly as we went through, but we also reached a point past which we couldn't really add any more, because then we would have to have gone back through huge bodies of literature to remap them. So it's a subjective list of themes, but hopefully useful for at least some broad navigations.
Yes, definitely.
And yes, Dana is one of them, of course.
Yes.
Generosity.
Perhaps if there's no more questions, we are actually past the 1 hour.